For Marx and many socialists today, capitalism is not a benign, neutral system of exchange and value. Rather, it is a violent system best characterized by the terms exploitation and class struggle. There are many reasons why Marx considered capitalism to be exploitative, but one that I want to describe briefly today is the most famous. This is Marx's theory of surplus value. This theory effectively describes, through a close analysis of the commodity, how capitalism as a system exploits the living labor of the working class for the benefit of the capitalist class. In other words, it describes how inequality emerges and deepens through the process of capital accumulation. We talk a lot today about wealth inequality, and we often talk about it in terms of how, for example, billionaires are merely greedy people who just don't want to share their wealth. But Marx, for his critique, isn't necessarily interested so much in the moral critique of the psychology of the rich. Instead, he engages in more of a scientific economic critique of the mechanisms of capitalist production. Marx's very long and brilliant book, Capital, is devoted to that very task. Marx was a careful thinker, and his conclusions were not rooted in just a kind of abstract moral judgment about the greed of capitalists, but rather it's rooted in a scientific examination of the mechanisms of capitalist production. And one of those mechanisms is the existence of surplus value. And so in order to analyze this, Marx begins by looking at the commodity, which is basically any product that's bought or sold, which contains both a use value and an exchange value. It has a value in terms of being useful, and then in value in terms of exchange. People will pay money for it. And so Marx describes a complex process of exchange and accumulation wherein the capitalist class who owns the means of production and reproduction buys raw materials to then produce commodities to sell for more than they originally put into it. We commonly call this that they do this for profit. Marx's brilliant question, however, is simply this: where does that surplus come from? He rejects the notion that it is merely a difference between supply and demand. Instead, he looks to the nature of the commodity itself, to the thing that's being bought and sold. And namely, he discovers that a commodity exists that's not a commodity that other capitalist economists like to talk about very often. But this commodity is perhaps the most important commodity. It's the commodity that is itself the source of all value. It is the commodity of commodities. And that commodity is human labor power. This is one of Marx's really radical insights, is that human labor itself becomes a commodity that is equally bought and sold. It's the commodity that is the source of value. And so with this, Marx makes a basic point that the working class is by definition a class without private property, which for Marx means that they have no ownership over the means of production. And instead that the working class is then forced on the threat of starvation to sell their labor to the capitalist class. And so that is why a number of socialists, including Marx's longtime collaborator Friedrich Engels, writes that under capitalism, the laborer is not necessarily unlike a slave was in the past. Whereas in the past, a slave sold themselves once to a master, the working class today must sell themselves piecemeal, hour by hour, in order to survive. And so, yes, there is the freedom to sell yourself to one capitalist over another capitalist, but there is no freedom under capitalism not to sell yourself to the capitalist class as a whole. And so all of this is based on this basic realization that human labor has become a commodity. It's been commodified. It's bought and sold within the capitalist system. By analyzing human labor power as a commodity, he recognized that it is this unique commodity because its use value is the source of value, meaning that in its consumption, this commodity, human labor, is not exhausted in its use, but produces new value in its use. In Capital, Marx explains it like this: in order to extract value out of the consumption of a commodity, our friend, the money owner, that is the capitalist, must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation on the market a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption is therefore itself an objectification of labor, hence a creation of value. The possessor of money does find such a commodity on the market, the capacity for labor, in other words, labor power. So in more basic terms, the laborer sells their labor power and therefore produces more value for the capitalists than what they receive back in wages. That surplus value is the key to the capitalist system, and it is why capitalism is exploitation. Not that capitalism includes an element of exploitation, or that it sometimes is the case that workers are exploited, but that capitalism as a system is in its entirety the exploitation of one class by another. And so that is why Marx emphasized so often the class struggle and began, for example, his manifesto with the very famous line that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. But what Marx uncovers with this is that this surplus value is the result of class struggle. Surplus value does not happen naturally. And so he explains this further down in the same chapter. He writes, "Nature does not produce on the one hand owners of money or commodities, and on the other hand men possessing nothing but their own labor power. This relation has no basis in natural history, nor does it have a social basis common to all periods of human history. It is clearly the result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older formulations of social production." In other words, this situation did not happen by accident. It was a direct result of a class struggle, and it was the result of the exploitation of one class by another. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels comment that the capitalist class is the most revolutionary class in history because it has led the charge in this process by acting to revolutionize industry in such a way that the capitalist class becomes the sole owners over the means of production, while the masses are then forced to sell their labor for survival. And so they comment in the manifesto about the idea of abolishing private property. Today we think of private property as just stuff that we own, like a book or a house or something. For Marx and Engels, private property had a special definition, which was the means of production. It was something that was a large-scale production. And so the insight that they have is that this call to abolish private property is actually really just the continuation of the revolution started by the capitalist class, because the capitalist class has already abolished private property for 9/10 of the population. The majority of people do not have any ownership over means of production, and that results in this very situation that they're describing, where there is on the market a commodity called human labor that is bought and sold because those individuals have no other option but to sell their very body themselves in order to survive, basically. And so Marx goes further to suggest, because of this dynamic within capitalism, that the poverty of the worker is directly proportional to the extracted value taken from them by the capitalist class. Inequality, then, is not a bug or a flaw within the capitalist system. Rather, it is built into the system itself. We cannot have a capitalist system without inequality, because the system itself relies on the inequality, on this very specific inequality in the form of an exploited labor and an exploiting capital. And so through this analysis of the commodity, Marx has looked at the basic process of capitalism, which is to buy and sell in order for profit, but he asked that extra question that isn't often acknowledged, which is where surplus value comes from. And he recognizes and he analyzes and comes to this conclusion, quite convincingly, this argument that the very system of capitalism relies on the unpaid labor of the working class, because they work for a set amount of hours, for example, and in those hours they produce enough for an X amount of value, but for their wages they get back about half of that, or probably far less today. In terms of their own wages. And so they receive just enough to sustain themselves, to live a certain life, but the capitalist class extracts value from them. And that's how, for Marx, the the capitalist goes into the market and receives more back than what they put in through commodities. And so Marx calls this commodity fetishism, this fact that it is kind of a magical system, that it's been obscured, that this is the process of what capital accumulation looks like. And so he lifts the veil and he says, this is what's really going on is exploitation, whereas it appears to be some kind of magical system where you put money and your money goes to work for itself and then it just rings back this return. But Marx's whole point is that that return is based upon the unpaid wages of the working class. And so capitalism as a system relies on the production of value, and that value has now been revealed by Marx to be produced by the labor of the working class, even though they do not receive the lion's share of that value back in return. And so that is the basic reason, one of the basic reasons why Marx argues that capitalism as a system is exploitative. There are obviously a lot more avenues to this that could be explored, but this is just one of the most famous examples of Marx's theory and his critique of capitalism. And so hopefully that was a helpful explanation for you. I highly recommend taking a look, even just reading through the first 4 or so chapters of Capital. That's where the bulk of it is. There's smaller books that Marx goes into this too, and I'll link some of those below. But this basically is the backbone behind Marx's basic analysis of capitalism, and the reason why capitalism is not seen as this benign, neutral thing, but is truly, at its core, defined, according to Marx, as exploitation. And so, thanks for watching. Let me know if you want to see more kinds of videos like this. Usually I talk mostly on this channel about theology, but an interest of mine is Marx because of an interest in liberation theology, and because I think Marx analyzes the conditions of the proletarian oppression today in quite scientific ways. But let me know if you'd like to see more of these videos specifically on Marx, and tell me what you think maybe about this in the comments below, or if you have any questions or concerns about this. But yeah, for now, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.